There are a lot of risks when participating in racing. These risks could potentially take someone's life, which is why cars used in races are made to be as safe as possible, especially for the drivers. Come with us as we discover what difference Mercedes and Ferrari have when it comes to porpoising. Well, what is porpoising and what does it do with Formula One racing? Well, let's elaborate on the term, shall we? Porpoising is when a car in Formula One bounces up and down. This phenomenon can be dangerous, especially when the machines are driving on fast corners. So why does this happen to 2022 Formula One machines? There have been some changes in Formula One's machines this year. Unlike the machines in 2021, these are not as smooth. The changes in regulations amending the aerodynamics of a Formula One car that were supposed to be implemented last year were postponed to this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. These newly implemented regulations include certain restrictions in aerodynamics to minimize drag on cars. However, Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile recommended 2 large venturi duct tapes on the underbody of the car to compensate for said restrictions. The depression generated through the air accelerating these duct tapes is what's causing the downforce. In an article written for F1 Chronicle, as the car cuts through the air thrusts through said duct tapes in the underbody of the machine, which then creates a negative pressure sucking the car towards the ground. This is the ground effect that creates the downforce. This downforce is what gives the cars the ability to take great speed on corners and race through the straight tracks. At the same time, the downforce keeps the car firmly in contact with the track, which gives the tires grip and traction. Diffusers are scattered within the air exiting, which is located at the end, hence, not forming vortices. They also ensure little drags and exiting air is cleaner on the racing cars, which also makes the other cars follow closer than they would. 2021 and 2022 air diffusers also differ, wherein 2022 Formula One car are much wider compared to the 2021 Formula One car. The airflow is believed to be about the speed of 150 km per hour, at which point it detaches itself from the upper edge of the diffuser, reducing the suction effect. This unloads the suspension, raising the car upwards. The easing of the load on the suspension will later be reversed, causing the cycle of aerodynamic loading and unloading in a rather rapid motion. While the car experiences this phenomenon, the driver feels as though they are traveling across a series of bumps on the track, which makes porpoising more dangerous when taking corners at high speed. With this hazardous phenomenon, it is unlikely that the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile has done not a single thing. The phenomenon was introduced in the 1980s when constructors were researching ground effects. With this, Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile responded by banning the tempering of the underbody that adds to its downforce by 1983. The latest change in the aerodynamics, however, took the engineers by surprise, the limitations of tunnel testing adding to the problem. Porpoising scope of effects can only be found out when the race has begun, which the elimination the more impossible. No team has ever eliminated porpoising's effects. However, when they undergo 2 rounds of testing sessions before the season's first race, they try to lessen the effects of porpoising as much as possible. They observe the machines on track and then make conclusions that might help the drivers when in an actual race. Why was porpoising a big factor in Mercedes' not good performance? In the recent Australia Grand Prix, Mercedes and Ferrari racing team were not an exception to suffering during the Formula One qualifying. However, catching sight of the difference between the performance of both teams was undeniable. When Mercedes' performance was significantly affected by the phenomenon, Ferrari and its racer, Charles Leclerc, was able to secure their second pole position of the season despite the effects of porpoising. Although when looking at the tracks and/or the onboard cameras, the effects of the phenomenon seemed to be identical. Both cars were seen to bounce vigorously as the underfloor aero stalls, which caused both cars to raise, then reattach, lowering it again. This causes the drivers' heads to bounce. So what made the construction made by Ferrari on Ferrari F1, F5 different from the Mercedes, which resulted in very different results? It is important to note that when cars are on a straight track, the effects of the phenomenon are not at all a big problem. making sure that it does not damage the car itself and the drivers do not shake with it. What the Ferrari team did certainly UPS the Mercedes, though. Just look at the results. Beyond that, what matters most is that the downforce sacrificed by the increased ride height mitigates the problem itself and the dynamic impact on the car in the faster corners, which based on the results Ferrari is much better than the Brackley-based team. As Toto Wolff, Mercedes team principal explains that the W13, the Mercedes machine used to compete in Australia Grand Prix, was having some technicalities when it comes to corners such as the high-speed turn 9 left-hander that follows the long back straight where the porpoising was worst. According to him, although there were other areas that the car should be improved, the previously said problem was a significant error. Wolff told reporters that the bouncing in their machine was worse to the point that they were carrying it when they go into the corners and into the high speed. He also added that curing the bouncing will surely not unlock a second within the car, but rather said that improvements are still to be made and that they can optimize a few others. Wolff stated in an interview that he is optimistic that they will get to the point in racing where they will succeed someday with lesser risk and more gain. It may take a while for them, may it be in the next 2 races or by the end of the season, maybe even 10 years from now. He added, "My time horizon is not a race weekend or a year, it's more like 10 years. He also continued that in the future he would like to look back on his past team and think about how far they have come. Wolff's interpretation was supported by the sector's time, as the fastest time set by Mercedes in the first sector was 0.235 seconds, 0.878% off Ferrari's best. In the middle sector, the slippage was not far off doubling in relative terms, 0.263 seconds. In the 33-second final sector, the deficit was 0.468 seconds. A clear difference between both teams is obvious in the straight-line speed of the cars. While the Mercedes drivers had to be more cautious in their approach, the Ferrari drivers were at their best, being faster than anyone in almost everywhere around the lap. According to Russell, one of the Mercedes drivers competing in the Australia GP, the biggest thing during the race was the bouncing. When Russell was trying his best to try all sorts of things to be on the limit of the bouncing, it cost him lose a lot of speed, especially through corners that are high speed, where in his words he said, "I lose all my lap time." He also expressed his concern about his confidence when attacking the bouncing. It affects the machine and the performance itself. When trying to control the bouncing, for instance lessening it, the speed is affected. This means that by sacrificing the machine's stability, drivers lose speed. Lewis Hamilton, also one of Mercedes' racing drivers, expressed his frustration about Mercedes' performance as well. However, he directed his frustration about how Ferrari, who experienced the same intensity of porpoising, was able to take a lead in both championships. When asked for the reason why Mercedes cars were not performing well, Hamilton states that he did not understand why and that anyone, if asked, does not know as well. However, setting aside statements from the racing team of Mercedes, Charles Leclerc also stated that porpoising definitely affected the racing cars of their own team, especially on the entry of turn 9, which was also stated by the Mercedes racing team that certain entry point greatly affected them as well. Hamilton and Russell place 5th and 6th respectively, and despite McLaren's Lando Norris being able to beat them over 1 lap, Mercedes continues to hold the title of having the 3rd fastest car, even if they did finish as the best of the rest in both Bahrain and the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. The Mercedes racers were placed as such after Carlos Sainz, Ferrari driver, suffered a Q3 disaster, and Fernando Alonso, represented Alpine, crashed after a hydraulics failure, making it impossible for him to downshift. In an interview, Wolff admitted that although he had not accepted this kind of result, he was still satisfied with it. Wolff voiced out how they were still learning the car and its components, and that nothing they did during the preparations for the Grand Prix has unlocked the aerodynamic potential or reduced bouncing, and that they, Mercedes, and other racing teams that competed, were still on the same page when it comes to handling the phenomenon. He told reporters that bringing updates about the conditions and advancements of the machine doesn't make sense, as it can cause confusion more, even if the fact that the more downforce you bring, the worse the bouncing gets. When it comes to problems, solutions are not impossible to obtain. However, it often takes time and effort, trials and errors. What happened to Mercedes in Australia Grand was part of their journey to curing porpoising. Make sure you stay connected and see you on the next one.